Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Beatrice Vance laughed as she flicked a drop of chilled champagne onto Elena Vance's medical discharge papers in front of the entire foundation board. The liquid bloomed like an oil slick across the diagnosis of a chronic heart condition, blurring the signature of Dr. Marcus Thorne. "Don't be so dramatic, Elena," she said, her voice like silk wrapped around a razor. "A weak heart is just a convenient excuse for a weak will. We have a gala to plan, and Julian needs those shares signed over before the banks close." Elena sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her fingers curling around the cold edge of her chair. The scent of white lilies, Beatrice's favorite, filled the room, cloying and suffocating. 3 other board members looked away, their silence a heavy, suffocating weight. They knew the truth, but in the Vance household, the matriarch's word was law. "I was in the ICU 48 hours ago, Mother," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. Her chest felt tight, a dull ache thrumming behind her ribs that had nothing to do with the surgery scars and everything to do with the woman staring her down. "And yet, here you are, perfectly capable of holding a pen," Beatrice replied. She adjusted her diamond-encrusted watch, the light catching the stones and throwing jagged reflections across the room. "Your brother has worked tirelessly on the downtown development. It's only fair that you contribute your portion of Arthur Vance's legacy to ensure the family name remains untarnished." Julian Vance leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He didn't look like a man who had worked tirelessly. He looked like a man who had spent the morning at the club, his tan too perfect and his smile too sharp. He wore a Rolex that Elena knew cost more than the specialized equipment her doctor had recommended for her home recovery. "Come on, Elle," Julian said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "It's just paperwork. You're not even using the dividends. You're too busy being a professional patient." A sharp, stinging heat rose in Elena's throat. She looked at her father, David Vance, who sat at the foot of the table. He was staring at his blotter, his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear into his expensive suit. He had always been a shadow in his wife's light, a man who traded his spine for a comfortable life. He wouldn't help her. He never did. Beatrice slid a fountain pen across the marble-smooth surface of the table. It clicked against the crystal vase of lilies. "Sign it, now. I won't have the committee thinking my daughter is a malingerer." Elena looked down at the document. It wasn't just shares, it was her autonomy. Her grandfather, Arthur, had left her that portion specifically because he knew Beatrice would try to bleed her dry. He had called her his awakening heart, a name that felt like a cruel joke now as her pulse skipped and stuttered. She felt the familiar cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. The room seemed to tilt. The sound of Julian's ice clinking against his glass grew deafening, like a hammer against an anvil. "I'm not signing," Elena said. The silence that followed was absolute. Beatrice's expression didn't crumble. It hardened into a mask of pure aristocratic fury. She stood up, her silk dress rustling like a coiled snake. "You ungrateful little girl," Beatrice hissed, leaning over the table. The smell of her expensive, musky perfume invaded Elena's space. "Everything you have, the doctors, the roof over your head, the very blood in your veins, belongs to this family. You are a liability, a broken, fragile liability." Beatrice reached out and gripped Elena's wrist, her nails digging into the skin just above the plastic hospital ID band Elena hadn't yet removed. "You will sign those papers, or you will find out exactly how expensive it is to stay alive without my signature on your medical bills." Elena stared at her mother's hand. She felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. It was the clarity of someone who had already looked into the abyss and found it empty. Beneath the table, her other hand was tucked into her pocket, her thumb pressing the side button on her smartphone. It had been recording since the moment she walked in. "Is that a threat, Mother?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "It's a reality check," Beatrice snapped, releasing her with a shove that sent Elena's chair skidding back. "Julian, get the lawyer on the phone. If she won't sign voluntarily, we'll move for a medical conservatorship. If her heart is so weak, surely she isn't fit to manage her own affairs. Julian grinned, pulling his phone from his pocket. Way ahead of you, Mom. Elena stood up slowly, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't look at Julian or her silent father. She kept her eyes locked on Beatrice, who was already smoothing her hair, the outburst forgotten as she moved back to her GALA notes. I'll leave, Elena said. You'll go to your room, Beatrice corrected without looking up. And you'll stay there until the notary arrives. Elena didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, her heart thudding a slow, rhythmic protest against her ribs. She felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, the digital record of a mother threatening to let her daughter die for a few percentage points of a real estate empire. As she reached the hallway, she heard Julian's laugh echoing behind her. She'll fold. She always does. She doesn't have the heart for a fight. Elena stopped in the foyer, the grand portraits of the Vance ancestors staring down at her with cold, painted eyes. She pulled her phone out and stopped the recording. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a predator who had just found the perfect bait. She looked at the front door, then at the stairs. She wasn't going to her room. She had one more call to make before the notary arrived, and it wasn't to a lawyer. It was to the one person Beatrice Vance feared more than a scandal. Elena pressed a contact she hadn't called in years. The phone rang once, twice. Grandpa, she whispered as the line connected. It's time. They think I'm broken. The next morning, the breakfast room felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing over a spread of poached eggs, smoked salmon, and artisanal breads that no one was eating. The air was thick with the sharp, clinical scent of Beatrice Vance's designer perfume, a fragrance that always reminded Elena of a sterile hospital wing disguised as a boutique. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, her spine a rigid line of silk and pearls. She didn't look up from her tablet as Elena entered. She simply tapped a manicured nail against the screen, the sound echoing like a metronome in the silence. You're late, Beatrice said, her voice devoid of maternal warmth. The notary will be here at 10. I expect you to have finished your tea and composed yourself by then. We can't have you looking like a waif when the documents are signed. It reflects poorly on the family. Elena pulled out a heavy mahogany chair, the legs groaning against the marble floor. She felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, a silent weapon loaded with the previous night's betrayals. She didn't feel the familiar flutter of panic in her chest. For the first time in years, her heart beat with a steady, cold rhythm. Julian Vance lounged across from her, his expensive suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. He was scrolling through a digital catalog of luxury vehicles, a smirk playing on his lips. He didn't even bother to hide his excitement. I've already put a deposit on the Italian model, Mother, Julian said, his eyes never leaving the screen. Red, of course. It'll look perfect in the driveway of the penthouse. Once Elena signs over the remaining shares of the trust, the liquidity issues will be a thing of the past. He looked up then, his gaze raking over Elena with a mixture of pity and triumph. He reached out and tapped his heavy gold signet ring against his crystal juice glass. The rhythmic clink, clink, clink was an intentional irritant, a reminder of the wealth he believed he had already won. Don't look so sour, Elle, he drawled. Think of it as a weight off your shoulders. You've always been too fragile for the pressure of the Vance name. This way, you can go off to some quiet cottage and knit or whatever it is people with delicate constitutions do. Let the men handle the empire. Elena picked up her sterling silver fork, the metal cold and unforgiving against her palm. She looked at her brother, really looked at him, the bloated entitlement in his face, the way he wore his arrogance like a shield. The empire, Elena repeated softly. She took a slow sip of her tea, the Earl Grey tasting like ash. Is that what you call it, Julian? I thought it was a real estate firm, not a kingdom. Beatrice's eyes snapped up from her tablet. Her gaze was a frozen lake. Don't be precocious, Elena. Your brother is merely stating the obvious. You've had your chance to contribute, and your health has proven to be a liability. This is for your own protection. My protection, Elena said, her her voice like a sharpened blade. "Is that why you told Julian you'd let me die before you let the shares go to probate?" The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the distant hum of the central air conditioning. Beatrice didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply set her tablet down with a slow, deliberate motion. "I don't know what delusions your medication is causing," Beatrice said, her tone reaching a level of frost that could kill a garden. "But you will sign those papers. You will do it because you are a Vance, and because you owe me for every breath you've taken in this house." Elena felt a surge of secret power. She touched the outline of the phone in her pocket. She thought of Arthur Vance, her grandfather, and the conversation they'd had in the dead of night. Arthur had been silent for a long time after hearing the recording, his breathing heavy over the line. Then he had said only 5 words. "Wait for the third knock." "I'll sign what needs to be signed," Elena said, her voice eerily calm. "But I think we should wait for the notary to arrive before we discuss my debts." Julian chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "She thinks she has a choice. That's cute, Elle, really." He checked his gold watch. 5 minutes, tick-tock, little sister." Elena leaned back, watching the clock on the mantel. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a countdown. Exactly 5 minutes later, the heavy front doors of the estate groaned open. Footsteps echoed in the foyer, not the light, hurried steps of the family's usual notary, but the heavy, measured tread of several men. Beatrice frowned, her perfect brows knitting together. "He's early, and he brought company." Elena stood up, smoothing her modest dress. She met her mother's eyes with a clarity that made the older woman visibly recoil. "That's not the notary," Elena whispered. The doors to the breakfast room swung open, and the color drained from Beatrice's face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. Standing in the doorway wasn't a clerk with a briefcase. It was Arthur Vance, leaning heavily on his cane, flanked by 2 men in dark, tailored suits who looked significantly more like federal investigators than legal witnesses. "Grandpa," Julian stammered, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering onto the marble. Arthur didn't look at his grandson. He looked directly at Beatrice. "I hear there's a business meeting this morning," the old man rasped, his voice vibrating with a quiet, terrifying rage. "I decided I wanted a seat at the table." 2 days had passed since Arthur Vance had stormed the breakfast room, yet the silence in the estate felt heavier than the shouting ever had. Elena sat in the dim light of the library, the scent of old parchment and beeswax clinging to the air. On the mahogany desk before her lay a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't just paper. It was a physical manifestation of the truth she had spent years trying to ignore. The door creaked open, and the sharp, rhythmic tap of designer heels announced her mother's arrival before she even spoke. Beatrice stepped into the room, draped in a silk robe that cost more than a year of Elena's medical treatments. She didn't look like a woman whose world was under threat. She looked like a queen surveying a rebellious province. "Still playing with your grandfather's dusty files?" Beatrice asked, her voice light and dismissive. She moved to the sideboard, pouring herself a glass of sherry. The crystal clinked against the decanter, a delicate, expensive sound. "You should be resting, Elena. Your heart, remember, all this excitement isn't good for someone as fragile as you." Elena didn't look up. She kept her fingers pressed against the envelope. "Arthur is upstairs with the auditors, Mother. They've been there since 6 this morning." Beatrice laughed, a cold, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Let the old man have his fun. He's 90. His mind isn't what it used to be. Once he sees the complexity of the Vance holdings, he'll realize Julian has everything under control. You, however, are making a spectacle of yourself. It's embarrassing." "Is it?" Elena finally met her gaze. "Or is it embarrassing that the golden son has been using the family trust as a personal slush fund for his gambling debts?" The mask slipped for a fraction of a second. Beatrice's grip tightened on her glass, her knuckles turning a ghostly white. Then the arrogance returned, smoother and sharper than before. "Julian is the future of this family. You are simply a liability we've carried out of a sense of duty. Don't mistake your grandfather's temporary pity for actual power. When he's gone, Who do you think will be signing your checks for those expensive specialists? Before Elena could respond, Julian Vance sauntered into the room, looking remarkably unbothered for a man under federal scrutiny. He smelled of expensive cologne and the faint, metallic tang of nervous sweat, though his smirk suggested otherwise. He walked straight to Elena, leaning over the desk to invade her personal space. "Give it up, sis," he sneered, his shadow falling over her. "Grandpa is senile. He thinks he's playing detective, but the board answers to me. I've already told them you're having another episode. They think you're delusional from the medication." He reached out, flicking the corner of the envelope with a manicured nail. "Whatever is in here, it's garbage. You're a sick girl in a big house, and nobody believes a word you say." Elena felt a familiar flutter in her chest, the warning sign Dr. Marcus Thorne had told her to watch for. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was a cold, steady pulse of resolve. She reached into the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't an audit. It was a medical report with a forensic signature. "This isn't about the money, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "This is the toxicology report from my last hospital stay. The one where you brought me that health smoothie every morning." The room went deathly still. The only sound was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Julian's smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. He stepped back, his boots scuffing the polished floor. "You're insane," he stammered, his voice rising an octave. "Mother, tell her she's insane." Beatrice didn't move. She stared at the paper in Elena's hand as if it were a venomous snake. "Elena, don't be dramatic. You've always had a flair for the macabre." 2 days, Elena said, ignoring her mother entirely. She stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. For the first time in years, she didn't feel fragile. She felt like the owner of the house. "The Vance Foundation's annual gala is in 48 hours. Arthur has invited the entire board, the press, and the local authorities. He told you it was to celebrate Julian's leadership." She tucked the paper back into the envelope and tucked it under her arm. She walked toward the door, stopping only when she was shoulder to shoulder with her brother. He smelled of fear now, unmistakable and pungent. "Enjoy the next 2 days," she whispered, her voice like ice against his ear. "Eat well, sleep while you still can, because at that gala I'm not just going to take your money, I'm going to take your freedom." She walked out of the library without looking back, the sound of her own steady footsteps echoing through the silent house. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of Beatrice's sherry glass shattering against the marble floor. Elena didn't stop until she reached the sanctuary of her own room. She pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Marcus," she said when the doctor picked up. "The evidence is secure. Everything is in place for the gala." She looked at the calendar on her wall. The date was circled in red, 24 hours until the final rehearsal. 48 hours until the Vance family name became a curse. Elena leaned against the door, her hand over her heart. It was beating perfectly. The next morning, the breakfast room was a stage set for a play that was about to be canceled. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the silver service and the suffocating scent of fresh gardenias that Beatrice Vance insisted on having delivered daily. Elena Vance stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her family. They looked perfect, a portrait of old money stability that was, in reality, nothing more than a gilded cage built on a foundation of sand. Beatrice Vance sat at the head of the table, her spine a rigid line of silk and pearls. She didn't look up from her tablet, her fingers tapping the screen with a sharp, rhythmic click that sounded like a countdown. Across from her, Julian Vance was nursing a double espresso, his eyes bloodshot and his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a croissant. He looked like a man who had spent the night trying to outrun his own shadow. "You're late," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over Elena's simple linen dress with a flick of practiced disdain. "I've already confirmed the seating chart for the gala. You'll be at the far end of the secondary table, near the catering entrance. It's for the best, considering your outbursts." Elena pulled out a chair, the heavy mahogany legs scraping against the marble floor with a jarring screech. She sat down and poured herself a cup of coffee, the bitter aroma of the over-roasted beans hitting the back of her throat. The far end? I thought the Vance daughter was supposed to be the guest of honor, considering the miraculous recovery you've been bragging about to the press. Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Guest of honor? You're lucky you're even invited after the scene you made in the library. Mother thinks you've had a nervous breakdown. Honestly, we're all just waiting for the gala to be over so we can send you somewhere. Quiet, for your own good, of course. He leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. It was the look of a man who believed he was untouchable because he had never been held accountable. He didn't know that the bank records Elena had secured yesterday detailed every cent he had siphoned from their grandfather's trust. He didn't know that Arthur Vance had left a contingency clause that Julian had spent 3 years trying to bury. A quiet place, Elena repeated, her voice remarkably calm. She reached into her pocket, her thumb brushing against the cold, hard edges of the flash drive Marcus had encrypted for her. That sounds lovely, but I think the house is going to be plenty quiet once the auditors arrive. Have you checked the foundation lately, Julian? I've noticed some significant cracks. Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. What are you talking about? The house is fine. I'm not talking about the architecture, Elena said, leaning forward. She watched a bead of sweat roll down his temple. I'm talking about the legacy. Grandfather Arthur always said that a name is only as strong as the truth behind it. I wonder what the board of directors will think when they see the truth behind yours. Beatrice slammed her tablet onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Enough of this nonsense. Elena, you are behaving like a petulant child. Your father is already stressed enough trying to manage the merger. David Vance doesn't need his daughter hallucinating conspiracies at the breakfast table. I'm not hallucinating, Mother, Elena said, standing up. She hadn't touched her food. I'm giving you a courtesy. Enjoy the caviar tomorrow night. Savor the vintage champagne. Because when the clock strikes midnight, the vacation is officially over. She turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm on the marble. Behind her, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. She didn't need to look back to know that Julian was reaching for his phone or that Beatrice was already planning how to spin the next disaster. 24 hours until the rehearsal. 48 hours until the fall. Elena stepped into the foyer and checked her watch. The countdown wasn't just in her head anymore. It was in the very air she breathed. She pulled out her phone and sent a one-word text to Marcus. Ready. The evening arrived with a suffocating humidity that even the estate's industrial-grade cooling system couldn't fully mask. The Vance estate had been transformed into a temple of glass and white orchids, the cloying scent of the blooms hanging heavy in the foyer like a funeral shroud. Elena Vance stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers tracing the cold, brushed metal of the small drive tucked into her silk clutch. She wasn't the trembling girl who had collapsed in the garden 3 months ago. Tonight, she was the ghost at the feast, and the feast was about to turn bitter. Beatrice Vance stood at the center of the room, draped in emerald lace that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. She was holding court with the wives of the board members, her laughter a practiced, melodic chime that never reached her eyes. When she spotted her daughter, the smile didn't falter, but her gaze sharpened into 2 icy points. She broke away from her circle, the train of her gown hissing against the polished marble like a viper in the grass. "You're late," her mother whispered, the words barely audible over the soft strains of the string quartet. She didn't offer a greeting. She reached out to adjust the collar of Elena's dress, her touch lingering a second too long, a silent reminder of the control she still believed she possessed. "And you look tired. I told the caterers to keep you away from the main stage. We can't have you fainting while the photographers are circling." "I'm feeling stronger than ever, Mother," she replied, her voice level. She watched a waiter pass with a tray of vintage champagne, the bubbles rising in frantic, tiny bursts. "In fact, I think tonight is going to be a revelation for everyone." Beatrice let out a sharp, dismissive huff. "Don't be dramatic. This is Julian's night. He's worked tirelessly to secure the Vance legacy while you've been playing at being a martyr. Try to stay in the shadows, Elena. For once, don't make your health the center of attention." Across the room, Julian Vance was already 3 scotches deep, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who thought he'd already won. He was leaning against a mahogany pillar, surrounded by a group of junior executives who hung on his every word. He caught Elena's eye and raised his glass in a mock toast, his lip curling in a sneer. "Look at her," Julian called out, loud enough for the nearby guests to turn and stare. The sleeping beauty finally woke up. "Careful, Elena, the music might be too loud for your delicate heart. Maybe you should head back to the East Wing before the real adults start talking business." The executives chuckled, a sycophantic ripple of sound that made the heat in the room rise. Elena didn't flinch. She simply watched him, noting the way his hand shook slightly as he took another gulp of the amber liquid. He was terrified, buried under layers of stolen prestige and expensive tailoring. "The music is just fine, Julian," she said, her voice carrying through the sudden lull in conversation. "I wouldn't want to miss the presentation. I hear you've put a lot of personal effort into the financial projections." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his features before he masked it with a loud, booming laugh. "More than you'll ever know, little sister. Now go find Dad. He's in the library hiding from the noise. You two can discuss your shared hobby of being useless together." Elena turned away, her pulse steady. She moved through the crowd, a sea of designer labels and forced smiles. She found David Vance standing near the tall French doors, staring out at the darkened gardens. He looked smaller in his tuxedo, the weight of 1,000 compromises sagging his shoulders. "She's pushing the merger through tonight, isn't she?" he asked without looking at her. The smell of old paper and expensive tobacco clung to him. "She's trying," Elena said, stepping beside him. "But the foundation is rotten, Dad. You know that. You've always known." "I just wanted peace, Elena," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I just wanted the screaming to stop. Peace without truth is just a slow-motion surrender," she replied. She felt a presence behind her before she heard the footsteps. Dr. Marcus Thorne moved into the light, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know him. To Elena, the slight nod he gave was a silent confirmation. The servers were primed. The guest list was checked. The trap was set. "The board is moving into the theater for the keynote," Marcus said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the atmospheric noise. He looked at Elena, his eyes steady and encouraging. "It's time." "Where is Julian?" she asked. "He's backstage, getting ready to present the new era of Vance International," Marcus replied. "Beatrice is already in the front row. She's invited the press for the final signing ceremony." Elena felt the weight of the drive in her hand again. It was a small thing, no larger than a thumb, yet it contained the digital DNA of her brother's fraud and her mother's complicity. She thought of her grandfather, Arthur Vance, and the way he used to talk about the integrity of a structure. If the load-bearing walls were built on lies, the only mercy was to tear it down. As the guests began to filter toward the private theater, the air in the ballroom seemed to thin. The anticipation was a physical pressure, a collective breath held by a room full of people waiting to see a dynasty cemented. They didn't realize they were attending an execution. Elena walked toward the theater, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm on the marble. She passed Beatrice, who was adjusting her hair in a gilded mirror, her face a mask of triumphant vanity. 30 minutes, Elena," Beatrice said to her reflection. 30 minutes and we're untouchable." Elena didn't stop. She didn't look back. "The clock is ticking, Mother. Make sure you're sitting in the front row. You won't want to miss a single frame." She stepped into the darkened theater, the velvet curtains shimmering like a stage about to be lit. Behind the screen, she could hear Julian's voice, high and frantic, giving last-minute orders to the tech crew. He thought he was about to step into the light of his greatest victory. He didn't know that Elena had already rewritten the script. She took her seat in the back, the shadows swallowing her whole. Marcus sat 2 rows away, his silhouette a silent sentinel. The lights began to dim, the room falling into a heavy, expectant silence. The screen flickered to life, the Vance International logo glowing in a brilliant, predatory gold. Julian stepped onto the stage, the spotlight hitting him with a blinding glare. He opened his mouth to speak, a wide, confident smile plastered across his face. "Welcome," he began, his voice amplified and echoing. "Tonight you're going to see the true face of this company." Elena leaned back, her heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. "Yes," she whispered to the darkness, "they really are." The projector hummed, a low, mechanical drone that filled the sudden vacuum of the ballroom. Julian stood in the center of the stage, his silhouette sharp against the glowing Vance International logo. He looked every bit the heir apparent, his chest puffed out, a designer watch catching the light as he gestured toward the screen. "This expansion," he declared, his voice booming with a confidence he hadn't earned, "is the culmination of my vision, a new era for the Vance legacy." Elena sat in the back, her fingers grazing the cool, brushed metal of the small device Marcus had helped her slip into the AV booth's bypass. She didn't feel the frantic thrum of her heart anymore, only a cold, crystalline focus. She pressed the button. The screen flickered. The glossy rendering of the Vance Heights project vanished, replaced by a spreadsheet that looked like a jagged scar across the golden backdrop. It wasn't just numbers. It was a map of Julian's greed. Shell companies, offshore transfers, and the unmistakable digital signatures of the funds he had bled from the company's architectural division. The very division he had claimed was failing because of Elena's lack of dedication. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. It pressed against the walls of the ballroom, stifling the breath of the city's elite. Julian's reaction was a slow-motion car crash of the ego. His jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge as the blood drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving his skin the sallow, translucent color of wet parchment. His eyes, usually bright with a predatory spark of arrogance, went flat and glassy, darting toward the wings of the stage like a cornered rat seeking a hole. He tried to speak, but his throat appeared to seize, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically against his silk tie in a desperate, silent gulp. His shoulders, once squared with the unearned pride of a king, slumped forward, making his bespoke suit look suddenly, pathetically oversized. A fine, rhythmic shudder started in his fingers and traveled upward until his entire frame was vibrating with the visible frequency of his own ruin. In the front row, Beatrice Vance gasped, her hand flying to the throat of her diamond necklace as if the stones were suddenly choking her. She looked at the screen, then at her son, her face twisting into a mask of horrified denial. Beside her, Arthur Vance stood up slowly. His face didn't show shock, it showed a grim, terrifying clarity. He didn't look at Julian. He looked back into the shadows, searching for the granddaughter he had nearly allowed them to destroy. David Vance sat perfectly still, his head bowed, his hands gripped so tightly on his knees that his knuckles were white. "There must be a mistake," Julian finally choked out, the microphone screeching as he stepped back. "This is a hack, a glitch. Tech crew, shut it down." Elena stood. She didn't rush. She walked down the center aisle, the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. The crowd parted for her like a dark sea, the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax thick in the air. When she reached the edge of the stage light, she stopped. She didn't look at the audience. She looked only at her brother. "It's not a glitch, Julian," she said, her voice amplified by the quiet of the room, steady and cold as a winter morning. "It's an audit. You told me once that I was a ghost in this family, that I didn't have the strength to leave a mark. But that's the thing about ghosts. We see everything you do in the dark." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a single, notarized document, the original blueprints for the Heights project, dated 2 years before Julian's supposed discovery, bearing her signature and Arthur's private seal. She laid it on the edge of the stage, the paper crisp and white against the dark wood. "The board is waiting in the library," she added, her eyes shifting briefly to Arthur, who gave a single, sharp nod of validation. "And the authorities are waiting in the foyer. You wanted everyone to see the true face of this company. I think they finally have." She didn't wait for him to find his voice. She didn't stay to watch Beatrice weep or to hear the board members begin their frantic huddle. Elena turned her back on the stage, her heart beating with a slow, healthy rhythm, and walked toward the exit. She left the lights, the lies, and the Vance name behind her, stepping out into the cool, honest air of the night. Behind her, the sound of Julian's world collapsing was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. 10 minutes had passed since Elena stepped out of the gala, but the vibration of the music still seemed to hum in the soles of her feet. The night air was sharp, tasting of salt, and the coming storm, a bracing contrast to the cloying scent of lilies and expensive perfume she had left behind. She stood by the stone fountain in the courtyard, watching the silhouette of the Vance estate. It looked like a palace from a distance, but she knew now it was just a gilded cage with rotting foundations. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open, spilling jagged light across the gravel. Julian Vance stumbled out first, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and his silk tie hanging loose like a noose. He wasn't the polished heir anymore. He looked like a man who had seen his own ghost. His skin had turned a sickly, translucent gray pulled tight over his cheekbones like wet parchment. Sweat beaded along his hairline, reflecting the harsh strobe of the emergency lights in a way that made him look frantic, unraveled. His eyes, usually so sharp with calculated arrogance, were now wide and bloodshot, darting between the officers and the silent crowd as if looking for a trapdoor that didn't exist. His lower lip trembled, a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that betrayed the cool mask he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. "Elena," he screamed, his voice cracking. He scanned the dark courtyard until his gaze locked onto her. "You think this is over? You think you can just walk away after what you've done to this family?" She didn't move. She didn't have to. 2 men in dark suits, federal investigators she had met with weeks ago, stepped into his path. Behind them, the board members followed, their faces masks of cold fury. Julian turned to them, his hands out in a pleading gesture that looked more like a beggar than a CEO. "Arthur, tell them," Julian hissed, reaching for his grandfather. "It's a fabrication. She's sick. She's always been unstable. The heart condition, it affected her mind." Arthur Vance didn't even look at him. He stood with his hands clasped over the head of his cane, his expression carved from granite. "The only thing that was affected, Julian, was my judgment. I trusted you with the legacy of this name. You turned it into a crime scene." The betrayal hit the younger man like a physical blow. He spun around, looking for his mother, but Beatrice Vance was standing several feet away, her face averted. She was busy smoothing the front of her gown, her eyes fixed on a point far in the distance, already calculating how to distance herself from the wreckage of her favorite son. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't even offer a glance. "David!" Julian turned to his father, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Dad, help me." David Vance stepped forward, but he didn't go to his son. He walked past him, his footsteps heavy on the gravel, and stopped beside Elena. He didn't say a word, but he placed a hand on her shoulder. It was the first time in 20 years she had felt his support, a silent admission of his own long-standing cowardice and a promise of a different future. "Mr. Vance, you need to come with us," one of the officers said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the courtyard. "Get your hands off me," Julian barked, his old entitlement flaring up for one final, ugly moment. "Do you have any idea who I am? I built this city. I am the Vance legacy." "No," Elena said, her voice quiet but carrying through the night air like a bell. She stepped forward into the light, her shadow stretching long and dark across the stones. "You're just the man who got caught." The officers moved in. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was surprisingly loud, a sharp, metallic finality that seemed to pop the bubble of the Vance prestige once and for all. The board members, men who had toasted Julian's health only an hour prior, began to disperse, whispering to their lawyers and pulling their coats tight as if the scandal were a contagious cold. Dr. Marcus Thorne appeared from the shadows of the porch, moving to Elena's side. He checked her pulse with a practiced, gentle touch, his eyes searching hers for signs of the strain. "Your heart, Elena. How does it feel?" She looked at her brother being led toward the black sedan, his head bowed as he was forced into the back seat. She looked at the house where she had spent a lifetime feeling small, feeling broken, feeling like a burden. She felt the steady, rhythmic beat in her chest, strong, certain, and finally free of the weight of their lies. "It feels like it's finally mine," she whispered. She turned her back on the estate, the flashing lights, and the ruins of the empire. She walked toward Marcus's car, her head held high. Behind her, the gates of the Vance estate began to swing shut, the heavy iron bars silhouetted against the dying light of the GALA. She didn't look back to see the front door close. She didn't need to. The reckoning was over, and for the first time in her life, the road ahead was perfectly clear. 6 months had passed since the iron gates of the Vance estate had clicked shut behind Elena Vance. The morning air at the construction site was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine sawdust and wet concrete. She stood on the plywood platform, the blueprints for the new Thorn community wing rolled tightly under her arm. Her heart beat with a steady, effortless rhythm, a quiet miracle she no longer took for granted. Marcus stood a few paces behind her, leaning against a steel beam. He wasn't checking her pulse anymore. He was watching the way she commanded the space. "The foundation is set, Elena," he said, his voice warm against the roar of a distant generator. "By spring, this place will be full of people who actually need the help your family spent decades denying them." She turned to him, a faint smile touching her lips. The pale, ghost-like girl who had spent years clutching her chest in the shadows of a mahogany library was gone. In her place was a woman whose skin had found its color and whose eyes had found their fire. She checked her watch, an old, sturdy piece that had belonged to Arthur Vance. It was the only thing she had kept from the estate, a reminder of the man who had seen her worth when no one else would. Across the city, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of stale jasmine and cheap cleaning fluid, Beatrice Vance sat at a laminate kitchen table. Her designer silk robe was frayed at the cuffs, and the diamond rings that used to weigh down her fingers were gone, sold months ago to cover Julian's mounting legal fees. There were no maids to bring her tea, no socialites calling to invite her to galas, and certainly no one to admire her carefully curated mask of perfection. Beatrice stared at a crumpled envelope on the table, a final notice for the apartment's rent. Her son, Julian Vance, was currently serving the first year of his sentence for financial fraud, his name a stain on the very legacy he had tried to steal. He didn't call her. He didn't write. He was too busy navigating a world where his last name carried no weight and his arrogance earned him nothing but bruises. The front door creaked open, and David Vance walked in. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit. Instead, he wore a simple navy uniform with a patch that read "Security." He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been 6 months ago, but his posture was straighter. He placed a small bag of groceries on the counter and didn't look at his wife. "I saw her today," David said quietly, his voice echoing in the small kitchen. "On the news, they're calling her the most innovative architect of the year. She looked healthy." Beatrice flinched as if he'd struck her. "She destroyed us, David. She took everything that belonged to this family and scattered it like ash." "No," David replied, finally looking at her with a clarity that bordered on pity. "She took what was hers. We're the ones who destroyed the family. We just didn't realize it until the walls fell down." He walked past her into the small bedroom, leaving her alone with the silence of her own making. Back at the construction site, Elena stepped down from the platform. Her boots crunched on the gravel, a solid, grounding sound. She felt a brief, sharp pang of loss, not for the money or the mansion, but for the childhood she'd spent waiting for a love that was never going to come. That was the cost of her freedom. She had traded the illusion of a family for the reality of herself. She reached into her pocket and felt the small, jagged scar beneath her shirt, right over her heart. It was a reminder of how close she had come to breaking, and how much stronger the mend was than the original bone. A black car pulled up to the curb, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. It was the lead investigator who had handled Julian's case. He approached her with a respectful nod, handing her a final set of documents. "It's over, Elena. The last of the Vance holdings have been liquidated. The funds have been transferred to the foundation as per the court order." She took the papers, the weight of them final and heavy. "Thank you." As the investigator drove away, Marcus walked up beside her. How does it feel? The very last piece of the empire is gone. Elena watched the sun catch the glass of the rising clinic. She thought of Beatrice in her small room, Julian in his cell, and the empty, echoing halls of the house she had finally escaped. She felt the wind on her face, the strength in her limbs, and the quiet, beautiful silence of a life no longer lived in fear. "It feels like the debt is finally paid," she whispered. She tucked the blueprints under her arm and walked toward the center of the site, where the workers were waiting for her direction. She didn't look back at the city skyline or the ghosts of her past. The road ahead was long, and for the first time in her life, she was the one holding the map. Behind her, the first beam of the new building rose into the clear blue sky, a monument to a woman who had finally learned how to breathe.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.